Hello everybody and welcome back to Grandview Entertainment. My name is Ryan. In today's video I will be talking about why I'll always defend the Amazing Spider-Man. To give you a little bit more of a background to why I feel this way, The Amazing Spider-Man is the first Spider-Man movie that I ever saw in the movie theaters. And I actually very much remember that experience very well, even for it being over a decade ago. So I understand that I definitely carry a lot of nostalgia with me for that. But I can say watched this more than any other Spider-Man movie. I don't know. I watched the Spider-Man movies a lot, but I'd probably say this is the one I've watched the most. And still, no matter how many times I watch this movie, I really enjoy it. And the main point I want to make in this video is why I feel The Amazing Spider-Man is the most underrated comic book movie of all time. And that's why I will always defend this movie. So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 main reasons why I believe The Amazing Spider-Man is the most underrated comic book movie. As always, if you could please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot more videos on the way with the busy summer movie season. So without further ado, let's get right into the video. Reason 1, Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. Now, to be clear, I love all 3 iterations of Spider-Man. But for me, Andrew is my favorite. His version of Peter Parker, while definitely different than Tobey Maguire and Tom Holland's, his does feel more modern and not overly nerdy, which I know for some people they don't like because that's what they loved about Tobey Maguire. But instead, he comes more across as a loner. And I feel like in modern day and for modern audience, teenagers like myself, that kind of is more accurate to someone who is in the more nerdy and unpopular group. They're not as over the top nerdy and they're just kind of more of a loner. Now, while I do understand why people like the Tobey Maguire version because that is more comic accurate, and I myself do like that, but I also do enjoy this Peter Parker's version, by Andrew Garfield. I do like that. And at the same time, he also gives that modern edge to Spider-Man while still making him feel very authentic to the comic books. So I very much enjoyed that he was able to give Peter and Spider-Man both kind of more modern versions of themselves, but especially when it comes to Spider-Man, he was still very authentic to the character. And if anything, at points, I think he was more authentic to the character than Tobey Maguire was. And at points as well, Tom Holland. I really do enjoy his Spider-Man, and I know that's something that a lot of people do agree with me on, but for me, I do really like his Spider-Man, and more importantly, even his Peter Parker. It's different, but I think it's, very still enjoyable, and it feels more modern, a more modern version of Peter Parker. And even talking a little bit more about the modern version of Peter Parker, well, obviously we talked about Tobey Maguire's being more similar to the old school comic books and more over the top nerdy. Andrew Garfield, in my opinion, feels like the most accurate to being a teenager and how they kind of act sometimes as the loner, and sometimes people are he's too cool. At times he can be a little cool, but most of the time he's just kind of a loner. He's doing his own thing. He doesn't really have a lot of friends. And at the same time, I do feel like he acted more like a teenager than kind of Tom Holland did, where I very much like Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man, but at times he could be a little, more like a middle schooler in some senses, a little, I don't want to use the word whiny, because I still love Tom Holland and his version of Spider-Man and Peter Parker, but at times I feel like, especially in The Amazing Spider-Man 1, Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker feels a little bit more like a more modern teenager. And I feel like he, at times, feels more of a modern teenager than Tom Holland's version. Reason number 2, the tone, and more importantly, how different and grounded it feels from all the other Spider-Man movies. Now, this film goes for more of a grounded approach to Spider-Man, which was clearly inspired by the comic book movies of the era. It came out after Batman Begins. It came out before the first Dark Knight. It came out the same year as The Dark Knight Rises. It came out a few weeks before, actually. And it came out the year before Man of Steel. Now, these were very much, well, besides them all being DC movies, these were more grounded attempts at these comic book characters. So this was very much the trend of the time going on. And obviously, outside of the Dark Knight, obviously, that, the Batman movies they're really good for, the more darker tone, and I feel like it feels more accurate then. And while I do like Man of Steel, I feel like the Amazing Spider-Man and the Spider-Man character is more appropriate to trying to do this type of, design, this type of style with Spider-Man. I think still making Spider-Man's world and origin feel realistic was an interesting direction. Even, the details of like how teenagers would realistically create a Spider-Man suit. This helps make the movie feel grounded, and I think for the character of Spider-Man, obviously besides the powers of, getting bit by a spider, it makes him, become like a spider. Like the whole character of Spider-Man, it's very realistic to do in a realistic movie because Spider-Man's always been one of the most down-to-earth and relatable superheroes. So while, the other Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, don't get me wrong, they have their moments where they're very much down-to-earth as well, but the kind of vibe and the tone they go for in the movies is very grand. And then now the Tom Holland movies, which is why I'm so excited for Brand New Day. While I very much like Tom Holland's 3 movies. I'm not a hater in any sense, but they definitely feel like the MCU, Disney, more up, version of Spider-Man. And they're very much inspired that, at least Homecoming is very inspired by John Hughes movies. And I think that's very cool. But I like how this movie was trying to go more grounded. And even this is why I like The Amazing Spider-Man 1 more than The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It's a very different feel than any other Spider-Man movie. And I think, for some characters, like for Superman, maybe, even though I think Man of Steel works, you would think for the character of Spider-Man, I think it works a little bit more to try to be grounded because Spider-Man is, very down-to-earth and, the most relatable superhero, in my opinion. Reason 3, James Horner's score and how its biggest strength is how different it is. Let me start off by saying the obvious. Danny Elfman's Spider-Man score is the best Spider-Man score. But this is in a close second for me. I really like what James Horner did with this Spider-Man score. I do enjoy, I'd say, all the Spider-Man scores, but I would definitely say this one always just sticks to me because of, the different scores they have, like for when he's becoming Spider-Man, the crane scene, which we'll talk about later, and, many different scenes in the movie. I feel like they knew what Danny Elfman did, and instead of trying to recreate it and do the same thing again, which I think would have been really stupid, and which I think they kind of try to do in the second Amazing Spider-Man movie. But anyways, this movie, they go for something different. They go for something that very much fits with the tone of the movie, this more grounded version of Spider-Man. And, I think James Horner crafted a very unique, interesting, and at times bold score. And while it's not perfect, it was mostly great. And that's why I personally, like I said before, would say it's my second favorite Spider-Man score. Reason 4, Peter and Gwen's relationship. Now, I won't spend too much time on this because I feel like whether you love these movies or you hate them, this is one thing that unites almost everyone. And I feel like this has been a main talking point for, basically as long as these movies have been around, that the main thing people will highlight, like I said, whether you like or don't like the movie, is the relationship and how good it is. And I would absolutely agree. I think this relationship is, very, obviously it's very real and obviously very just well done by the director, Mark Webb, but also very well acted by Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. And obviously, as we know, it was very much, helpful that they were actually in a relationship. So they definitely knew their own ways to add to make it seem more real. But like I said, I won't spend too much time on this. I really enjoyed both of these characters in both of these movies, especially in this one. And like I said, they had really good chemistry, and the relationship was just so real and so good. And then for reason 5, I have the 3 best scenes of the movie that I'd like to break down, and these 3 scenes definitely are one of the main reasons why I love this movie, of course, with the other ones I've listed above. But these 3 scenes really, in my opinion, make this movie truly amazing. So now I'm going to give you the 3 best scenes of The Amazing Spider-Man. Scene 1 is going to be the bridge scene. Now, this scene defines the character Spider-Man, and I think it perfectly captures Peter Parker as well at his core. That's someone who's willing to risk everything to save people, no matter the danger or what's going on. Obviously, when we go into the scene, the Lizard is terrorizing the bridge, and Spider-Man is wanting to obviously stop him. But obviously, that's when the dad, says his kid's trapped in the car. So Peter obviously lets the Lizard go to focus on the kid. And the scene just between Andrew Garfield acting, and I don't know who the kid's actor, his name is, but it's a very well done scene, and a very Spider-Man scene where he just, tells the kid, hey, just a normal guy, and gives the kid his mask, and obviously later on, when the kid, is coming up to him, puts the mask on, gives him strength, as he said. So it's just a very well done scene by especially Andrew Garfield acting it, and it was just, like I said, very well done. And in my opinion, this is when in the movie Spider-Man really becomes Spider-Man. And I think earlier in the movie, obviously, we see him get the costume, like a few minutes earlier, and then eventually he fights the car jack, the car thief guy. But he's not really Spider-Man then. He's still kind of out for vengeance for Uncle Ben's killer, and he's still on the look for that. He kind of plays with the police and he, throws their gun away. And he's not really Spider-Man yet. But this scene, he learns more of the responsibility he has, when he saves the kid. And at the end of the scene, he goes, I'm Spider-Man. So that I think for us, this is him officially now becoming Spider-Man. So the bridge scene, obviously, it's very well shot. It's very well done, very well acted. And most importantly, this is officially when Andrew Garfield's version becomes Spider-Man. Scene 2 is the high school fight scene. This is the standout action scene of the film, and in my opinion, is one of the best action scenes in the entire franchise. And honestly, it's definitely the least appreciated, because I don't really hear a lot of people talk about this action scene, compared to other ones. And while I don't think it's the best one, I think it definitely deserves, its flowers. It definitely deserves some respect, because, like I said, most of the scene was CG, and I think they, CG artists definitely did a great job at this, because, I never knew that until I was able to watch the behind the scenes and learn that. But like I said, the scene is so well done. It's a great fight scene between the Lizard and Spider-Man, and it's cool that it's in the high school, obviously. So there's just a lot of really cool elements to that, besides it also being well done. And then, of course, we get the best Stan Lee cameo, in my opinion, of any Marvel movie. Like, I know there's a lot of Stan Lee cameos for me. This one's always been number one as the best Stan Lee cameo. It is actually hilarious. But, this whole action scene is so good. It's so well done. And every time I watch this film, it's one of the most entertaining parts of the movie. The high school fight scene is amazing. Pun intended. And like I said, I feel like it's an action scene in the Spider-Man franchise that should be talked about more than it is. For scene 3, I kind of cheated, and I wanted to include both of these two scenes. So the first scene is the crane scene. Now, obviously, the scene is also beautifully shot, and it definitely just feels generally inspiring. Seeing the city come together to help Spider-Man perfectly represents what makes the character Spider-Man so special, but also what makes the character of New York in these movies so special. And I think for a really good Spider-Man movie, you have to have both, obviously, a good Spider-Man, but also New York City is going to be a great character, because when you have both of those working well together, you have something really special, and you get scenes like this one that I thought were amazingly done, because obviously the crane operator was the guy from the bridge. So therefore, with Spider-Man saving his son on the bridge, that, this guy was able to be like, Spider-Man helped me, let me help Spider-Man. And it's just, once again, comes to the character of New York, and it was very well done. And the scene itself is amazingly shot, with Spider-Man swinging between the cranes, and the music by James Horner really shining here as he goes to fight the Lizard. And then the final scene of scene 3, the second half, I guess, will be Captain Stacy's promise. So this happens, obviously, after the final fight with the Lizard. And obviously, the Lizard kills Captain Stacy. The whole scene around this, obviously we see the Lizard become Dr. Connors again. And, the whole scene and conversation between Peter and Captain Stacy, that, people are going to get hurt. Sometimes people closest to you. So he wanted him to promise him that he would leave Gwen out of this. And obviously, this goes on for the rest of the movie, where obviously he promised Captain Stacy, and then, he leaves Gwen alone, of course, where he doesn't go to the funeral, and, obviously that's where we get at the end of the movie. Sometimes, those are the best choices, I believe, is the line. Don't quote me on that, but basically, the entire end of the movie, he tells Gwen he can't be together, and he kind of goes against that at the end. But this then goes into the sequel, where obviously, because he ignores Captain Stacy's, promise, at the end, Gwen dies in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So this is a thing that's it's very much important and a well-done scene in the first film, but it ends up being kind of a hinting that hey, if he doesn't leave Gwen alone, Gwen's going to get hurt. And that's obviously what happened in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So it's just more, the scene itself was well done, and also it has further implications for this version of Spider-Man. So these two scenes, for different reasons, I think, are both so well done, in my opinion. And the final point I'll make about The Amazing Spider-Man is obviously the reputation that this film has. And while it's more the second one that I think a lot more people like myself are not huge fans of, this film, in my opinion, should not be lumped into the same category as The Amazing Spider-Man 2, because, first of all, besides the tones and some, these two movies, while they're technically, in the same universe and sequels, they do feel different. And I feel like The Amazing Spider-Man 1 does a lot of good things in the Spider-Man franchise. Now, obviously, there's no getting around it that, I think when this movie came out, people didn't really want a reboot, Obviously, I think I went into it with a more open mind because, obviously, I grew up with the Spider-Man movies as a kid, but I was only 7 when this movie came out, and for me, this was the first time I got to see Spider-Man on the big screen. So for other people at the time, Spider-Man 3 came out in 2007, and while it wasn't liked, Tobey Maguire was obviously very loved as Spider-Man. So to get a new reboot only 5 years after, you get a basically beloved trilogy, put this movie in a very hard place. And I think, I think they did a great job with this movie. And the point of this video is, obviously, I want to talk about why I will always defend this movie. And that's because I truly do think it is a great movie. Now, I will say, I don't think it's the best Spider-Man movie. I do think that probably would be the original Raimi movie, but even the second one, I understand why a lot of people love it more too. But that's not the point of the video I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make of this video is why I do think The Amazing Spider-Man is a great movie. And why, in my personal opinion, I think it is the most underrated comic book movie of all time. Now, that's a bigger statement, I know, but for me, it's just a great movie, and it's a great Spider-Man movie. And I think while maybe some people obviously don't like the sequel, and it unfortunately ends up this franchise doesn't really end up going anywhere because, like I said, you only have the sequel, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and then the franchise obviously was canceled for Tom Holland's reboot in the MCU. And I'm not necessarily saying I don't, mind that, because I like Tom Holland and I love the Spider-Man in the MCU, and I'm very excited for Brand New Day. But I think we should always try to look upon this movie more, fondly, because I very much love this movie. But like I said, I am biased because, I saw this movie when I was 7 years old, and, there's no way to put it, this is my version of Spider-Man. When I think of Spider-Man, I think about when I was, very young, seeing this on the big screen. And like I said, this might not be my favorite Spider-Man movie, but this is definitely the Spider-Man movie I have watched the most. So that is why I will always defend The Amazing Spider-Man. And that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you for checking out this video and checking out my channel, Grandview Entertainment. As always, if you could please like and subscribe to the channel. I have a lot of exciting content on the way. More movie reviews, more movie talks, and movie ideas that I would like to share with you guys. So as always, like I said, please like and subscribe. And thank you for checking out my channel, and I will see you in the next video.